Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another lesson. In today's tutorial, we'll be able to go through some of the important causes of inflation. This is a very important topic because a lot of 8 mark essay questions in paper 2 and many MCQs in paper 1 are concerned with this topic of causes of inflation. So let's begin. Actually, there are two main causes of inflation. Let's first focus on the first one, which is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is when the aggregate demand of the economy rises so much that the aggregate supply cannot meet that increase in aggregate demand. So that is when there is an increase in the price level, which causes demand pull inflation. So this is a smaller definition that I've written here, which is when there is too much aggregate demand in the economy relative to aggregate supply, which causes an increase in the price level. So this is also a perfectly valid definition for demand pull inflation. As you can see in this diagram, this is a very good illustration of when demand pull inflation takes place. There are three areas of increase in aggregate demand that we are concerned with. The area of the black aggregate demand, the area of the blue aggregate demand, and the area of the green aggregate demand curves. So let's actually look at the area of the black aggregate demand curves. As the aggregate demand is rising here, you can see that even though the output level is rising for sure, but there is no increase in the price level here. The price level is actually constant, right? Let me actually see whether the microphone is on. Yeah. So as you can see, when there is an increase in aggregate demand, there is no increase in the price level, which means there is no demand pull inflation that is taking place here. The reason for that is, even though the aggregate demand is rising, but because there is so much excess capacity in the economy during this time, and there is so much high unemployment during this particular time, that an increase in aggregate demand actually doesn't lead to an increase in the price level and doesn't cause demand pull inflation to take place. However, as we move forward and as the aggregate demand keeps on rising, and we move to the blue area of aggregate demand. So as you can see, an increase in aggregate demand here will cause an increase in output, but it also causes an increase in the price level. So demand pull inflation is taking place, right? This is because obviously now unemployment has fallen and the economy is in its intermediate capacity, which means there is some sort of a capacity, obviously, but not a lot, to produce more goods and services. So as a result, unemployment is low, and that causes an increase in aggregate demand, causes demand pull inflation. Now, during the green part of this diagram, as you can see, an increase in aggregate demand here only causes demand pull inflation, only causes the price level to rise. The output doesn't rise. The reason for that is because the aggregate supply here is a vertical curve. The reason for that again is because the economy is at its full employment level of output. So an increase in aggregate demand cannot cause an increase in output. The only thing it can do is increase the price level. So this is only causing demand pull inflation. This is actually considered to be bad for the economy, because no increase in output and only a large increase in the price level will obviously ultimately lead to a fall in the purchasing power of the general population, because people's purchasing power will fall. Obviously, standards of living will fall because the price level is rising so much. Right. So this is basically what demand pull inflation is. Now, the causes of demand pull inflation are related to the components of aggregate demand that we studied in chapter 5. So the components of aggregate demand are consumption C, investment I, government spending G, and export minus import X minus M. Right. If any one of these components rises, that will lead to demand pull inflation, because that will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, right? And probably the biggest cause of demand pull inflation is actually monetary inflation, because in monetary inflation there is an increase in money supply, which means people have extra cash to spend, which means people will spend on goods and services, meaning their consumption will rise, and they will spend on in businesses as well, which means overall investment levels will rise in the economy as well. So C rises, I rises, and since these are components of aggregate demand, the aggregate demand will rise as a result, which causes demand pull inflation. So monetary inflation can, or actually money supply, an increase in money supply can and most likely does cause an increase in demand pull inflation, and this is one of the biggest causes of demand pull inflation in any economy, right? So this is all about demand pull inflation. Now let's focus. I'll just quickly talk about one more thing related to cost push inflation, but in probably a couple of minutes. First, let's actually define what cost push inflation is, which is the second important cause of inflation. So cost push inflation is when the economy experiences a rise in cost of production, which leads to a fall in aggregate supply of the economy, causing the price level to rise. As you can see here in this diagram, as the cost of production rises, the aggregate supply of the economy falls, which leads to an increase in the price level of the economy. And as you can see, not only is the price level rising, the output level of the economy is also falling, which means the unemployment will be rising as well. So three bad things are taking place due to this cost push inflation, and that is actually causing what is known as stagflation to occur. What is stagflation? We discussed this in the first lesson when we were talking about inflation. Stagflation is obviously, inflation means inflation, stag means stagnation of the economy. That means the output is stagnant, unemployment is rising, everything is bad basically. So as you can see, cost push inflation can actually never be good for the economy. Cost push inflation is always bad for the economy, because it not only causes people's purchasing power to fall, it also causes unemployment to rise, output levels to fall as well. Right? But when we were discussing demand pull inflation can actually be good quite a few times. And this is when there is creeping demand pull inflation that is taking place. What is creeping inflation? We discussed that earlier when we obviously talked about stagflation. But let's quickly recap. Creeping inflation is when the rate of inflation is less than 5% in the country. And ideally it is between 2 to 3%. Right? So when the economy is experiencing 2 to 3% inflation, and that is again due to an increase in aggregate demand, that is good for the country, because number one, the rate of inflation is low, which means it isn't affecting people's purchasing power by much. The prices aren't rising very quickly. Number one. Number two, because this is demand pull inflation, that means a rise in aggregate demand is causing an increase in output, which means there must be an increase in the employment levels, which means there must have been an increase in income levels, right? So the economy's growth is taking place, unemployment is falling, and at the same time the rate of inflation is healthy at 2 to 3%. So creeping demand pull inflation can actually be considered very good for the country, right? And we'll talk about this in our next lesson as well, when we discuss the consequences of inflation. But I think this is a sort of a good summary for when is demand pull inflation good, and obviously cost push inflation is always bad, because that leads to stagflation. Right? Now, what are some of the important causes of cost push inflation? There are 5 main causes of cost push inflation. Number one is wage price spiral. Wage price spiral is when the wage levels in the economy rise, which causes the increase in wage in the economy, or the increase in income in the economy, causes cost of production to rise, which leads to an increase in the price level. This spiral or this cycle is known as wage price spiral. Let's go through this cycle through this chain of analysis that I've drawn here. So, wage price spiral is when workers believe that they deserve higher wages, and not only do they deserve higher wages, their purchasing power is actually low, their living standards aren't as much as they want, so they would want higher wages, they demand higher wages. So when they demand higher wages, and obviously firms and industries give them higher wages, that means the cost of production for those industries and firms increases. As the cost of production rises, this means the aggregate supply of the economy will fall. When aggregate supply of the economy falls, we know that the economy experiences cost push inflation, there is an increase in the price level. When the price level is high, or it has risen again, This means the purchasing power of those workers and the general population in the country will fall because the price level is rising. This means to counter that, those workers will again ask for higher wages. So the wage demand rises. And more often than not, this wage demand is accepted, wages rise, which again increases cost of production, which again leads to a fall in aggregate supply, which again causes cost push inflation, which again leads to a fall in purchasing power, hence an increase in the demand for wage. This chain, this cycle is known as wage price spiral, and this is one of the biggest causes of cost push inflation, number one. Number two is an increase in energy prices. When there is a rise in the energy prices of the country, like what Pakistan has been experiencing for some time now, oil expensive, electricity expensive, natural gas expensive, that will lead to an increase in cost of production, which leads to a fall in, which leads to a rise in the price level. Right. Number three, a decrease in factor productivity, especially labor. Again, this is something that Pakistan has been experiencing again. When factor productivity is low, that means firms' average costs are rising, which means overall the price level will increase because firms aren't able to counter their rise in cost of production. So all of this causes a rise in cost push inflation. Number four is imported inflation. Now, imported inflation is actually of two types. I've drawn this table to actually explain what imported inflation is. Imported inflation, the first type of imported inflation actually doesn't cause cost push inflation. So, the first type of imported inflation actually is basically, you can say, caused when you are importing, or when we are importing final goods and services from abroad, like cars. Now, cars aren't used as factors of production. So let's suppose we are importing cars, and those cars are becoming expensive. Maybe because our exchange rate is depreciating, or maybe because the prices of cars in international markets has risen, right? Have risen, right? So they're becoming expensive. That means now this won't lead to an increase in cost push inflation. This will just lead to an increase in inflation because those imported goods, those final goods that we're importing are expensive, which will bring in that inflation into our economy. This is one type of imported inflation. And this is actually, a lot of the times people consider this to be the third cause of inflation besides demand pull and cost push inflation. But the type of imported inflation that causes cost push inflation is when we import raw materials and capital goods which are becoming expensive. Right? We're importing raw materials and capital goods from abroad which are expensive. That will cause the firm's cost of production to rise, which will lead to an increase in cost push inflation. So this type of imported inflation leads to a rise in the cost push inflation. Right? And finally, another cause of imported inflation is when the interest rate rises. An increase in interest rate can also cause cost push inflation, because an increase in interest rates leads to an increase in the cost of borrowing. When cost of borrowing rises, because obviously when you're borrowing money, you have to pay interest now, right? So when interest rates increase, that means you have to pay more money for that loan that you've acquired. So the cost of borrowing will rise. And if you're borrowing money to produce goods and services, that means the cost of production is rising, because the borrowed money has become expensive. So the cost of production is rising, which means aggregate supply will fall, which will mean the price level will increase. This is what cost push inflation is. So this is another cause, a smaller cause, but another cause of cost push inflation. One last thing that I want to talk about is actually exchange rate depreciation. Exchange rate depreciation actually can cause both demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Right? This is very interesting. How so? Let's quickly go through this. This is very important. You should know this because there have been many 8-mark questions again in paper 2 and a few MCQs as well that have asked about how exchange rate depreciation or devaluation causes inflation. So exchange rate devaluation or depreciation can cause both types of inflation. Again, we'll talk about exchange rate devaluation or depreciation in detail once we move to chapter 8. But for the time being, exchange rate devaluation or depreciation means that our currency is becoming cheaper compared to the world currency. Our currency is cheaper. So when our currency is cheaper, that means our goods are cheaper for foreigners. Our exports are cheaper. Which means the demand for our goods, the demand for our exports will increase, which means our export revenue will increase. Right? When export revenue increases and there is an inflow of money from abroad, our aggregate demand will increase because X is a component of aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand increases, we know that demand pull inflation will take place because aggregate demand will shift to the right. As for, and by the way, sorry, before I move forward, this type of inflation is actually good for the economy because this inflation is happening because of an increase in exports. So unless the rate of inflation was already very, very high, in that case, this might not be very good. But if the rate of inflation is manageable, this type of inflation might be good for the country. But exchange rate depreciation can cause another type of inflation, that is imported inflation and cost push inflation. How so? So when exchange rate falls, when our currency is becoming cheaper, that means our foreign goods are the goods that we are importing from abroad, they are becoming expensive for our cheaper currency. And when those imported goods are becoming expensive for us, that means if we are importing important raw materials and capital goods from abroad, those imported raw materials will become expensive. And because those imported raw materials become expensive, our cost of production will increase. And because our cost of production increases, our aggregate supply falls, which leads to a rise in cost push inflation. This is bad for the country. So as you can see, exchange rate depreciation is actually causing a double effect on inflation. It is causing, or it can cause, demand pull inflation as well as cost push inflation in the country. Right? So this is a very important concept and phenomena that you should know in the concept of inflation. We'll talk about exchange rate in a lot of detail in chapter 8. This was a relatively shorter lesson because I wanted to actually divide causes of inflation and consequences of inflation. In the next class, we'll be able to complete this chapter of inflation by going through the consequences of inflation. It will also be a relatively shorter class of 15-20 minutes, inshallah. So till then, all the best. Hope to see you in the next lesson. Allah Hafiz.